Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.
Welcome, viewers, to the second podcast of the Doctor's Lab with Dr. Khalid Green and myself, Dr. Abdul Haqq Baker. And as we highlighted in the first of these podcasts, we will be looking at particular matters and issues relating to Islam, and specifically in some instances, understandings and delineations like Salafism, and really examining and disseminating papers and academia that's spoken about movements in Islam from an outsider perspective. And we will be redressing the imbalance and providing insider perspectives based on the fact that two of us, as converts to Islam and also adhering to Salafism, Salafiyah, have prepared and delivered our PhD successfully and highlighting insider perspectives. So as Dr. Khalid highlighted the last podcast, his experience not only as a Western academic, but also from an Eastern perspective as a student of knowledge. So the table that we bring, we will be placing particular topics on that table, dissecting it, disseminating and elucidating upon that, providing alternative perspectives. So Dr. Khalid, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah again.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hayyakum Allah. Real
Today,
pleasure to be here. Yes.
And likewise, and to be back with you, mashallah.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to look at reclaiming the terminology. And what we mean by that is that so much has been written about Islam, and we've seen terminology, classical terminology, being misappropriated, being bastardized, and being demonized in such a way that Muslims today are shy to use particular vocabulary that is throughout the annals of Islamic history. And more to the point, it's within the Quran, it's within the prophetic sunnah of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it's caused a sort of apologetic and defensive stance to elements of the terminology. So we will look at some of that today. But before going right into that, I also want to look at terms that have been transposed onto the Muslim faith, terms like radicalization, fundamentalism. So what do you say to that before we get into the mix of these things, inshallah, the midst of things, should I say?
What do I mean in relation to the terms of fundamentalism and so forth, or what exactly are you?
What do you share that you've seen that a lot of the terminologies that are classical to our faith have been misappropriated and put into different contexts, which has made the Muslims apathetic and very nervous to use them?
Absolutely. They've hijacked many of the terms. And what's interesting is the research that I know you're aware of, that Edward Said has done regarding fundamentalism and stuff like that, with him even being a Christian, maybe he's Palestinian or Egyptian, I'm not sure. But he actually was hitting hard back at the fact that the West and others have defined these things from, and demonized many Islamic concepts and hijacked those terms. So he really hit hard back at them and about that, I guess you could say, colonial misappropriation of our terminologies and so forth. Yeah, really, really heavy stuff. Now,
no, Jazakallah khair. And what I want to do, I think, before we go into, as I said, some of the Islamic terminology, because I'm going to want you to elucidate particularly upon how Salafism is looked at, and we will look at its origins of the terminology. Is it a new term? Is it a classical term? Where is the use being misappropriated, misused, misabused today, and what's the proper connotation? Should we continue using the terminology? And others around that, I think Wahhabiyya, we know we spoke about Salafi Jihadi and everything, so we're going to get into the terminology today, and hopefully for those who are viewing, be they Muslims, we hope it imbues in them a sense of pride in the manner in which we're going to reclaim aspects of the terminology. And I hope for the non-Muslim viewers, it will provide a better and comprehensive understanding and a more nuanced and classical understanding away from the modern terminologies and the explanations that have been given by Western academics and newly come Johnny come lately, if I may say, academics today. So what I'll start with, looking at the term radicalization, and I'm referring to aspects of my PhD studies here. Here we see, in this vein, the term radicalization has been replaced with a more descriptive connotation, that of violent extremism, in an effort to encapsulate the precursory stage of terrorism. Now, some researchers try to pinpoint the exact period when the term radicalization, as it's witnessed on the scale that we see today in the Muslim world, emerged. And one academic, Bukhaz, he points to 1967 as a definitive date upon which the basic ideology of radical Islam, as they call it, turned into a powerful extra-political force on the 7th day of the 6-day war, that war with Israel. You mentioned when we spoke in the last podcast, remember the NYPD report on radicalization and indoctrination, and they came with a very crude, I think very simplistic definition, which it suited their purpose, but it doesn't cover. I don't think it does. It doesn't encapsulate radicalization as it's being understood in a wider context away from Islam. And they said here, terrorism is the ultimate consequence of the radicalization process. The progression of searching, finding, adopting, nurturing, and developing this extreme belief system to the point where it acts as a catalyst for a terrorist act defines the process of radicalization. And before going on to into that in more detail, previously, we know that radicalization was a phrase that was accepted across Western vernacular. Students, by virtue of studying in universities, were encouraged to be radical. We see that many movements and societies were founded upon radical ideas. So this transposing of the term radicalization to make it appear more insidious and to when targeting Islam, I think is something that's disingenuous, and I think it's something that is problematic and deliberate from a Western perspective. So I know maybe your element of research didn't touch upon radicalization in the way that I'm looking at it from a Western perspective, but do you have any thoughts on what you've heard from these discourses describing radicalization?
Yeah, well, I basically concur with what you said. However, but with also acknowledging, and as you do in your research, as I benefited quite a bit from your research, especially on the micro level, talking about the process of radicalization. So using that as a term to refer to a process of moving to extremism. So I see that as we see that they've hijacked this term, and we see how it's used in a very negative way to connotate all of Islamic activity. Mostly, you know, anyone who's adherent to 5 daily prayers is a fundamentalist. You know, and they've really hijacked this term. However, we also acknowledge that there is a process of radicalization for those movements and those ideologues and others who are actually who move from orthodoxy, basically. You know, they move from being on the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and following Orthodox Islam to a more extreme paradigm, I guess we might say, you know, and leading to action, violent action as well. Yeah.
No, I agree entirely with you on that. And I think we cannot deny that there is radicalization, but we need to note, as you've said, that there's actually a process of radicalization. And I think if I do not use the term radicalization in isolation, I talk about violent radicalization. I know that in the David Cameron, from his Munich speech in 2010 or 2011, I think it was, when he spoke about non-violent extremism and the precursor to that being radicalization, but he didn't qualify, and the government did not qualify. Is there non-violent radicalization? They've spoken about violent radicalization, which is something we have to acknowledge. But when speaking about radicalization in and of itself, it should still have the connotations that preceded its current understanding, that of radicalization being problematic as it refers to Muslims. And I'll explain why. Because here in the first International Conference on Radicalization and Political Violence, which was convened in London January 2008 by Peter Newman and his organization, he stated this: the idea of radicalization is a relatively recent one. As late as the early 2000s, hardly any reference to radicalization could be found in academic literature on terrorism and political violence. The term was used casually, but little was done to systematically develop it into a conceptual tool through which to understand the process that may lead individuals to support violent extremism. Even now, the term continues to lack definition. Some critics have voiced their concerns that the idea of radicalization could be used to criminalize protest, discredit any form of radical thinking, and label political dissent as potentially dangerous. And here we are in 2020. This was 2008 that he wrote this. But here we are in 2020 that we see that any form of protest, even when we're looking at what's taking place in America at the moment, and the recent Trump speech, in his the recent speech he gave, talking about the protesters as though they are criminals. We discreditation of any form of radical thinking today, students and the like, and any political dissent is seen as politically dangerous, all under this new connotation of radicalization. And the epitome of that marginalization, of that being used pejoratively, is against Muslims. So you're right, it is a problem. And this is why I wanted to start with just the very term of radicalization now. So I suggest, as I do now and have been doing for the last few decades, when we speak about radicalization, we must speak about violent radicalization if we are talking about this precursor to extremism. But radicalization in and of itself should not be couched under that umbrella.
Yeah, I see. I definitely share some of your perspective there. I guess it's hard for me to divorce radicalization or being radical or associating it with anything positive in and of itself as a term. We know that, I guess radical is just in a very layman's term, it's going against the norm. So of course we know that there's often if there's cases where the norm is oppressive and evil and so forth, going against that norm is going to be perceived as radical. The Uyghurs in China are perceived as, radicals. This is the premise that the Communist Party is using to clamp down on them, or at least with the world. But as a term, it's in my mind, it seems like it carries a negative connotation anyway. It's hard for me to think of a good usage of it, and especially from an Islamic perspective. You wouldn't, when it comes to orthodoxy, you're not going to say it'd be hard for me to conceive, or it's hard for me to conceive of a positive use for it. But yeah, no.
And that's interesting, because again, what you're saying, what comes to mind when we discuss radical, or the terminology in radicalization, is you're saying within the religious framework, it has that negative connotation in your mind, and I can understand that. Then is that because we're looking at different eras? Because let's go back to the origins of Islam. What happened with the spread of Islam and the revelation upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? What happened in that society then? That was very radical. That turned the entire status quo upside down. That was very radical, but that fits with what you've said as a paradigm, that the hierarchy, the structure that was in place, the apparatus that were in place was corrupt, it was wrong, it was negative. So anything that came and pushed against that, being the purity that Islam brought as well, seen as radical. And the same happened when you look at radicalization and radicals away from Islam. when Christianity started spreading through Rome, or it came into Rome and things, it was seen as radical again in that instance as well. Before it was adopted, and it brought down that particular structure. So I suppose it's to do with context as well, and time. I think the time or the era that one is living in dictates that as well. That moves me on to, before we get into the Islamic framework now, that moves me on to another generic term that has been transposed amongst Muslims and is looked at negatively, whereas it didn't need to be when it was being viewed from a Christian perspective. And that term that I'm looking at here is fundamentalism. Okay. And I mentioned here in my PhD notes, unfortunately, present usage of this terminology overlooks its previous religious association and connotations.
Yes.
As it stands today, both literalism and or extremism are often attached to its ultimate meaning. Now, when we look at the Oxford Dictionary, for example, and its definition of fundamentalism, it states the following: a religious movement which originally became active among various Protestant bodies in the United States after the war, the First World War, 1914 to 1918, based on strict adherence to certain tenets held to be fundamental to the Christian faith. And then I listed a number of these tenets, which were 9 in number. And I won't go through them in too much detail, but they believed in the infallibility of the Gospels, the literal interpretation of those Gospels, and that they were divinely worded. Everything in the Gospels being a foundation for the life of a Christian. And from there, the name fundamentalist is established. Rejection of modern viewpoints and theories relating to theological studies that are critical of the Gospels. Rejection of scientific discourse that contradict the Gospels, such as the theory of evolution. Rejection of separating religion and the state. Belief in millennialism, that the world is approaching an end and a war of Armageddon will take place after Jesus returns. Accepting fundamentalism as the correct ideology and practice for Christianity, and based on those 8 points above, the true Christians are therefore fundamentalists. If you remove the term Christianity and Bible and you place that with Muslims, with the following the fundamentals of the faith, they are very, very similar in parallels. Okay. I think there's rejection of modern viewpoints. Some might hold that and say, oh, that's regressive. No, it says specifically about theories relating to theological studies that are critical.
Aqidah, creed.
Exactly. So also, when we look at it from a lexical perspective, 2 academics mentioned this. It means the bases or foundations, and Shoup and Haddon defined fundamentalism. And I think this is a very good point to focus on when we think about fundamentalism. They stated it is truly a modern phenomenon. Modern in the sense that the movement is always seeking original solutions to new pressing problems. Leaders are not merely, leaders are not merely constructing more rigid orthodoxies in the name of defending old mythical orthodoxies. In the process of undertaking restoration with contemporary demographic technical centers, new social orders are actually being promulgated. And that's an amazing, this is regarding Christianity, the Christian faith. So when we're talking about fundamentalism, it in and of itself is not a bad terminology. However, when you look at how it's being looked at through the lens, through the prism of Islam and Muslims, he's a fundamentalist, connotation of extremism, connotation with violent radicalization. But here, you said, you interjected very poignantly when I wrote, I repeat the first sentence, it's truly a phenomena. Okay, Salafiyya isn't, but it's modern in the sense that the movement is always seeking original solutions to new pressing problems. Leaders are not merely constructing rigid orthodoxies in the name of defending old mythical orthodoxies. There's an undertaking of restoration within a contemporary construct. And that's what needs to be understood about those. The term Islamic fundamentalism is a new phrase as well, and that usage rose after 9/11. And I'm going to conclude on this point of this terminology so we can jump into. I'm going to ask you to elucidate and elaborate upon the first term that we're going to talk about within the religious context or Islamic context now, Salafiyah. But here, when we're looking at Islamic fundamentalism as it's been highlighted today, an individual academic who I criticize, I find him unsophisticated, find basic, biased, anti-Islamic. He stated here, when referring to Islam, the term fundamentalism as applied to politicized, militant, and iconoclastic religion is a misnomer, because Islam as such, and in fact all authentic religions, are fundamentalist in that they pertain to the fundamentals of life and of existence. Nevertheless, the current meaning of the term is clear enough, as are its connotations of militancy, of being highly politicized, and of its being something new and antithetical to the orthodox religion. So this last part that he quotes, I disagree with. But the first element, we're saying, look, Islam and all authentic religions are fundamentalist in that they pertain to the fundamentals of life and existence. That much we can agree with him on, I believe, in that particular instance. So I think I've brought two terminologies at the start of this podcast, speaking about the non-Muslim terminologies that have been transposed within a Muslim context. Okay, radicalization and fundamentalism. Now I want us to dive in more specifically to look at terms that have become, I think, boiling points, if you like, or hot potatoes in their usage. And I hand it over to you to I will interject and contribute, and we'll continue the dialogue. But I want you to take up at this point Salafiyah. Salafism.
Salafiyah. Okay. So Salafiyah, I'm going to go exactly to my research on how I used it, because basically this is my usage of terms, how I defined it in order to have it as a working definition to proceed through my research. So I defined Salafi first, a Muslim who adheres in creed and methodology to the understanding of the first three generations of Muslims. So that, that basically the Salafi is a practitioner of Salafiyah or Salafism, if you will, who their orientation in understanding Islam, especially in creed and their methodology, the way they articulate dawah, the way they propagate the religion, is going back and is restricted, if you will, to the understanding of the first three generations of Muslims, meaning the companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam radiyallahu ta'ala anhum ajma'in, and the tabi'een, basically in reference to their students, if you will, and the itba' tabi'een, which would make up the third generation. And there's a lot of text to substantiate this. There's so much text because, again, my research is really looking at the Salafi perspective. I'm going into Salafi text, Salafi discourse, Salafi scholarship, and how they define themselves. And obviously, with me being a practitioner of Salafiyah, meaning what I believe to be Orthodox Islam and the fundamentals of Islam, that I refer to myself as Salafi and that methodology. And so Salafism, I also defined, and I might even, when I'm looking back at this term, some of these terms, I almost see some ways of maybe perhaps reworking it. So here's how I defined it. I said a contemporary descriptor for the creed and methodology of the first generation of Muslims. So Salafiyah, or Salafism, if you will, it has always had a precedence in the Islamic faith. It's always been there. Now, the way we use it in more contemporary times perhaps differs from, we don't have the same precedence or way of defining. You know, we use it as a descriptor, as I guess you could say, like a descriptive terms, an adjective or what have you, describing the practitioner of Orthodox Islam, you know, adhering to what the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is, and how his companions, which is very important, this qayyid, they say, this restriction of how we understand and approach Islam. And as you mentioned prior, you talked about the looking for solutions to contemporary issues by referring back to the the source text, the Quran, the Sunnah, and how the early generations understood Islam, even if those issues are not were not dealt with. So there's other principles. It's what's very important here, and this is a very fundamental principle of my research, is that we have to deal with principles. So even in determining who is a Salafi, what is legitimate Salafism, or who's a legitimate Salafi, all of these determinations refer back to Islamic principles. We have principles, jihadi, he's sururi, claiming Salafiyya. This one is a Qutbist claiming Salafiyya. This one is this, and all of these other ideologies that refer back to individuals who claim to latch to Salafiyya. When we look at it on the scale of these principles of determining who is a Salafi and how we determine that, we see the shortcomings and we see where they fall short and where they deviate from that. I don't know if you want to add anything in there.
No, I think that what you're saying is very important. I was thinking as we were speaking, and what I think would be, if you don't mind me adding, because I want you to continue on this, with looking at Salafiyya, the audience need to know, and I know that Sheikh Uthaymin spoke concerning this, Salafiyya is not a hizb. And I want to refer to a statement of Sheikh Ali Hassan al-Halabi on this, which I think, and I cited this in my PhD, and I think it really encapsulates what you're saying. And what he says here is as follows. Sheikh Ali Hassan says, upon mention of the terms Salafiyya and the Salafis, many think about the existence of a hizb, a group or party, or the development of hizbiyya, biased partisanship, or the likes. Yet none of that is the real case in regards to the upright Salafi methodology, the manhaj, and the idea of its preachers. For Salafiyya really means the correct comprehensive Islam, which Allah revealed upon the heart of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Salafiyya is not at all a restricted term for a group of people. Rather, it is an ascription to the Salaf, mentioned in the book, the Quran, and the Sunnah. So all who understand the deen according to the understanding of the righteous Salaf of the Ummah is Salafi, whether he mentions it frankly and openly or is quiet about it. So Salafiyya is not a party, group, or organized movement. Rather, it is for all Muslims, groups and individuals, because it is comprehensive Islam according to the book and the Sunnah, with the understanding of the Salaf Saleh. He then concluded by stating, so it is incumbent on the Ummah to compare its situation ideologically, practically, perceptively, and exclusively with the manhaj of the Salaf and their application of the deen.
Excellent. I want to interject with a couple of short quotes, if I may. This is a beautiful quote by Imam Muqbil bin Hadi al-Wadi'i, Allah yarhamuhu, who also very, very similar, but just this, again, this is the definition how Salafis describe themselves, how they describe Salafiyya. So Imam Muqbil, he argues, he says, the founder of the Salafi dawah is the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he says the ascription, so this is when we were talking about ascribing ourselves to Salafiyya, the ascription to the dawah is not like the association of the Hizbis, meaning the partisan groups. Its whole purpose is to actualize in practice these esteemed attributes in the one who ascribes to it. So very much in line to what you said about Sheikh Ali Hassan. And then there's countless quotes. I'm just going to quickly, one other quick statement of Ben Uthaymeen, because you mentioned Ben Uthaymeen. Here's one of the statements of Ben Uthaymeen. He says, the most authentic dawah, because it does not contradict the sacred text, it is the most knowledge-based path, because the Salaf took their creed from the book of Allah and the sunnah of his messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Moreover, it is the wisest path, because they took the way they were obligated to take, based upon the literal meaning of the text. And of course, there's a lot of details that we could go into. I want to just mention something else, because a lot of people seem to have confusion about Ben Uthaymeen's some of his statements. You know, there's a well-known statement that's cycled around, if you will, and YouTube videos and people commenting and people using it in all kind of different ways. And it's very important when you talk about really in dealing with anyone that we use maybe a general statement they make in light of specific text that they use, you know, that we use everything in the proper context.
That's
and
right.
So what we see is that Ben Uthaymeen in the statement, I'm sure you're probably referring to, because he probably is a few statements that I've come across, is that he does not deny the fact of using the term Salafi. But as you said, it's that the tazkiyat an-nafs, or the bigging up yourself and making a group based on disavowing those people who disagree with you and disagree with un-Islamic principles. You know, that's kind of a general thing, in that he is negating the fact, because what we've seen many people who misappropriate Salafiyah, and they go on to make it, they fall into the principles of Hizbiyah. And that's another term I defined in my definition of terms. It was absolutely necessary, because there are so many people who claim Salafiyah, but yet they violate many of its principles, and they end up referring back to themselves as being the reference point instead of the Salafi dawah. Okay. And so this is what I rest pretty assured that Ben Uthaymeen was speaking about this. When we look at it in light of his other things, he was afraid, or he saw it even in his time, that there were people who were using the term to say, you know, it just became a name. You know, are you Salafi? Oh, okay, you're a Mubtadi'ah then. You know. Oh, you're not with us. You don't listen to our few scholars. Oh, you're an innovator in the religion. You are left orthodoxy. And so that's very important to know that it's about principles. And this is why in my first chapter, I also laid out a very important principle, which in Arabic, if I might, and then I'll quickly translate it, is that al-ibra bi haqa'iq laysa bi musamiyat, which means that the reality of something is in its substance, not in its name. So, for example, the Salafi jihadis, they say, hey, we're Salafi. I know Abu Hamza and some of the Takfiri ideologues of this time that were in the UK, they didn't probably use Salafi in a high, they didn't claim that. So I need to go more intricately than I would. But there are many Takfiri ideologues who are much bigger than them in the Arab world, even ISIS and others who claim Salafiyah. And they claim that orthodoxy, and they see this thing. And there are extreme Sufis, meaning people who emphasize mysticism to a level of where they even depart from Islam, some of them, by saint worship, grave worship, and so forth, who claim and exalt the Salaf. They'll quote Hassan al-Basri said, Imam so-and-so said, Imam Malik said. They will use that because, as even some of the Western academics mentioned, and I don't have any quotes at this very second, but who mentioned that, that a lot of authenticity Islamically, for all the groups comes through claiming that they follow the Salaf, basically, those first three generations, regardless of how far they are away from it. So that's what's so important of establishing that not everyone who has that name and not everyone people give a name is necessarily adhering to those principles. And it can become a new hizb, as you said. It can be to where you're not down with us, you're not down with my clique, you're not down with my sheikh or these two sheikhs or these three sheikhs, then you definitely are not Salafi. This is an abuse and a misuse, and it actually makes this is a principle of Hizbiyah, which I'm sure we'll probably get into at some point as well.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Khalid, for that. And I think that leads on very nicely to reactionary Assalamu alaikum, this question that he's asked. And I just want to answer that briefly. I think we're both in agreement on this. Now, Salafi publications, those who will know that I've done a series regarding them and their cultism, but yes, they are Salafis. We will not disagree on that.
I'm surprised to hear that from you.
No, some people are. They are Salafis.
I'm very shocked. I'm going to fall down and I'm going to get right back up. Okay, go ahead.
No, I've never said they're not Salafi, even though I think them to be a cult. And some of the descriptors that you've given there, I would subscribe them or ascribe them to them in that instance. If you're not with them, you're not Salafi. Your tabdi is done on a huge scale. But yes, they are Salafi. We cannot, despite what some others who have a bias towards them, if I'm looking strictly at the principles and looking at the evidences that are there, only one who has got, I think, cognitive bias and unconscious bias against them will say no, that they're not. So that's my position. That has never changed, even though I hold what they are doing within Salafiyah as being reprehensible. So I hope that answers reactionary straight statement. We're not going to shy away from things here. And as you can see, as I said, Dr. Khalid and I, we disagree about particular things concerning the cult, but he's just been surprised today to hear that, no, they are within Salafiyah. They are within Salafiyah.
Very shocked.
I have no doubt about that.
Okay, well, I guess I'll chime in. So, again, I do almost shy away from these type of questions, but I would say that they, as some of our scholars have pointed out, like Imam Wasiullah Abbas, one of the great Indian scholars there in Mecca, he is, referred to them as Hizbis, and many others. There's many Salafi scholars who have departed and have realized the problems with especially with specific individuals in their group. And I would say that I find it a bit, I don't know, I find it kind of problematic if we say that if you say they're a cult and then they're Salafi, because I think it's just a contradiction in terms. I don't think we can say that they're in the fold of Salafiyah. I think what we would find, or what I see, is that we have so many different parties going on there with this group think. Okay, we see the elements of, as you pointed out, cultism and the Hizbiyah, these dangerous traits. And we got countless stories from people who've been on the inside, and people who I know, so many students of knowledge that I've met and that I've known personally, who've had nightmare experience. We could just write volumes showing the absence of Salafiyah. This is a huge question, but that's a good point. The reason why I disagree with that, and reactionary saying that the answer was soft, we've got what we've got to look at when we're looking at things. Yeah, I would want to see the evidence. You may have individuals who are amongst the cult who have departed from Salafiyah, but then that does not mean that the cult within itself are no longer Salafi. We've got to be careful about these nuances here. So you may have individuals in there who have departed from Salafiyah because of their extremism. But then to say no, that cult within itself cannot be Salafi, because we have the same thing on a wider context. You've got cults within Islam, okay? We have cultism within Islam. We have Hizbiyah within Islam. And it doesn't remove many of them. Some it does, for sure. It does remove many of them from within the fold of and framework of Islam. And I want to say, from my perspective, I'm not a student of knowledge within the Eastern sense. Academically, Western, yes, I will accept that there is a knowledge in what I've studied. But me now, and I think this is one of the things that principles or methodologies that some of us lay people in the student of knowledge sense depart away from. There'd need to be a clear precedent for many of us as lay people
where scholars have said they are not Salafi. This organization in itself, in generality, the members are not, or the leaders are not Salafi, based upon evidence. But what we have today, there's so much name calling,
reactionary, I would say. If sorry,
okay, and
I was going to say, he says if S-pubs are Salafi, then you have to call ISIS Salafi. That's batil. That's absolute falsehood. No, I think this is a reactionary comment, and I think there's no way you could claim that there's a similitude there. Extremism, okay, there's extremism in issues of tabdi', but you can't compare to takfir. There are many nuances. When you declare someone is not, you excommunicate them from the religion of Islam, is different from excommunicating from the Sunnah, even though that's shadid, that is severe, as some of the Salaf mentioned, that you taking someone off the Sunnah. That's why it's always better to be cautious. You highlight some of the problems with the organization, but there's no doubt they've done a plethora of good works, translating and laying a foundation for many people to even be exposed in a general sense to the Dawah to Salafiyah, even if there were problems and problems became greater over the years, that there was Hizbiyah, that there was Kethra, there was a lot of excommunicating people from the Dawah. But with that, we don't want to make everything so black and white. You don't want to be too black and white. You have to give the haqq and put everything in its proper place. So you don't want to go to an extreme and say, no, they never had any good, and we're better off having the Kutubis, and we're better off having a Planet Muslimin. No. And I don't know, this kind of gets away somewhat from our thing if we get too much into these things, but
yeah, and I think we can move from that. Yeah. I think where I want to move on from this particular point.
Yeah, go ahead.
Reactionary, it's good that you're engaging. I think you can see that we're trying to address the issues at head on, but we're talking about terminology here. But what Dr. Khalid has said here about tabdi and takfir, you can't conflate the two and then say, right, ISIS and this cult are one in the same because one does tabdi, one does takfir. No, they're two totally different things, as Khalid has just said. What I would say,
and adherence to the scholars, those guys make takfir of everyone who differs with them. Yes, guys might make tabdi of everyone who disagrees. You can find similitudes, but you don't want to conflate those similitudes and make a merge. Okay, here I just merged these two. You don't want to say, okay, and it's all one and the same, throw it all out. No,
that's right. And also, I would say this though, this is where you and I do disagree. When we're talking about the good outweighing the bad, I would say from my experience and categorically that the negativity of this cult far outweighs now. It's overtaken the good that has been done because the focus that's been upon them from now has been this internecine disputes, tabdi, writing off, going against scholars in the way that they've gone against scholars, lies, everything. So for me, and this is me looking, I saw them from their inception. I know some of their leaders personally and some of their members personally. So what we would do, we've digressed, and thank you, reactionary, love you too, for Allah's sake, mashallah. What we would do, we've digressed slightly. I want to look at some other aspects here now, which is quite interesting when we see what is being discussed about Salafiyah. And this is a paper that I've got here, the construction of Salafiyah here. And it says here, and we've seen this, Khalid, and you've heard this a lot as well. We say, to be sure, Salafi epithets sometimes appeared in religious literature, at least from the 12th century onwards. This is talking about the emergence of the usage of the term or Salafi as an adjective or a noun. It says, but however, they were on the whole more restricted in meaning than they later became. This is the use of the term. In many cases, they referred to a purely theological stance. Given the lack of empirical support, it would be presumptuous and ahistorical to equate the doctrine of the forefathers, madhab al-salaf, with the broader concept of Salafism as Salafiyah, that commands so much attention and often encompasses theology, law, morals, and etiquette. And I'll read the last part here, and I want to bring this back to you. Then it goes on. On the other hand, the belief that Jamaluddin al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdul spearheaded a movement of Islamic modernism called Salafiyah in the late 19th century relies on assumptions rather than evidence. Contrary to conventional wisdom, and despite numerous attempts to portray these two men as Salafis after the fact, there is still no proof that they ever promoted Salafi epithets, used the substantive Salafiyah, or conceptualized a religious orientation of that name. So I agree with that. So many want to say Salafiyah is a modern term. It was spearheaded by Jamaluddin Afghani, Muhammad Abdul, and it wasn't. They never subscribed to Salafiyah. They never claimed to be Salafis. And even when we look at their theological, ideological premise, I think it was Ash'ari in one of them. I haven't looked at all of my research there. Did you look at that as well? And what would you say? I'd ask you to speak about what is being said here, the origin of referencing the term Salafiyah.
So first I would say, so the Salafi creed and methodology can be traced back to the traditions of the early Sunni Muslims, such as Ahl Hadith. Very, very important. And so throughout time, what is known, what we refer to as Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah, has had many names. And that's not the problem of having a name necessarily. In referencing that name is usually a reaction to the advent of new ideologies and new religious movements arising that pose a threat to orthodoxy, orthodox creed, go against the Sunnah. So they referred to themselves in the past as Ahl Athar, the people of the Athar, referring to the people of narration, Hadith narration, and the narrations of the Salaf. Ahl Hadith, Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah, Ahl Sunnah, Firqat al-Najiyah, the saved sect. Okay, so this is where there's a lot of controversy for a lot of people, but it actually refers back to a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then in more contemporary times, it's become more, we use the term Salafiyah to refer to those people of the same methodology, of that same, they share that same creed of Ahl Hadith, that same, so I see it as a chain, a connection, that there is a connection. It's not a disconnect, as a lot of the Western the Western academics allege, nor as a lot of their critics, especially from being the most prominent amongst them, being Sufi academics and others, that they have a tendency, they want to divorce that. They want to say, hey, this is some new ideology. So many people always comment to me, you guys are just an innovative group and this and that and the other. And a lot of times it's it's whimsical. Yes. It's not based on evidence. We can go back and we can see, well, is Salafiyah espousing the creed of Imam Ahmed and other great imams? And more importantly, they are not our imams, as Imam Muqbil said. The head of the Salafi dawah is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, yes. So and as the person posted, Ta'ifatul Mansura. So those are various names that Ahlus Sunnah use, which all have Sharia. They're Sharia-based terminologies. Whereas, for example, if you look at Maturidiyah, you look at Ash'ari, they refer to what? To individuals.
That's right.
So why is it someone has to say, well, I'm going to go back to someone in the 3rd century, okay, 300 whatever, and I'm, or whenever the advent of Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari and Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, going back only 1,000, 1,100 years or whatever the case may be. Why don't they go to Umar bin al-Khattab then and say that we're Khattabi, we are this? So you see, one of the traits of the sects and the Hizbi groups, if you will, is that they adhere to individuals. And that's why the other people who attack Salafiyah in contemporary times say, you guys are Wahhabis, you guys are followers of Ibn Taymiyyah. No, those imams were revivers in their time of that same methodology, that same minhaj or methodology or way of understanding Islam, the same approach to the divine text. They were revivers of that. And they helped, and Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah just helped to codify and revive and, we have a plethora of knowledge in the various sciences because of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed and bestowed upon that great Imam who has the title Shaykh al-Islam, the scholar of Islam. He was so well versed. And what he has done in giving dawabit and criterion, codifying the methodology of the Salaf, the methodology of Ahl Hadith, the methodology of Ahl Athar, the methodology of Taifat al-Mansura, and all of these other names that they took throughout time, it is all in one.
Yes, and the codification of Salafiyya is one and the same.
Yes.
That's why when we see some of the more recent codifications I would say from the cult and from other elements, we reject particular codifications because they don't fit in with that train and that line of history that you're speaking about. And it's the viewer has to be very observant of the fact that this trying to name pejoratively, derogatorily Islam or Salafiyya with Wahhabism and other names, this is not new. The whole Muslim Ummah used to be called for centuries by the Orientals Mohammedans, and the Muslims rejected this terminology because we would say, no, we do not follow, we do not worship Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Yes,
we adhere to the Quran and Sunnah. Yeah. And the Sunnah as taught and implemented by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So in a wider religious context, the Muslims were called for centuries Mohammedans. Okay, so
yes.
we have to beware that when we are hearing Wahhabiyya and these terms being ascribed to Salafis, it's a pejorative term, it's a derogatory term to belittle this particular I don't want to say just movement because it's beyond being a movement in that instance.
Orientation towards Islam,
yes.
Something like this. Yeah.
And I want to also, Khalid, there's something interesting. I'm going to be a bit mischievous here. There was something that I was reading. As we said, we're going to be looking at some papers, and I'm looking at one that was translated, a perverted balance between Salafism. And I'll give the full title there, but this is from someone from the Muslim Brotherhood who made a statement concerning one of their leaders made a statement in 1991 regarding Salafiyya. Listen to what he says here. Some of it, I say, okay, it resonates, but it's where he ended up. So he said here, and I'll give you his name shortly, the term Salafiyya has been abused by both its proponents and opponents. The proponents reduced it to formalities and disputes about questions of rational theology, law, and Sufism. The opponents describe it as reactionary, opposing renewal, tajdeed, innovation and rational deliberation, ijtihad, and as recognizing neither the middle way, al-wasat, nor moderation, al-ittidal. The truth is that this is an abuse of the true Salafiyya and its genuine propagators, Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah and his student Al-Imam Ibn Qayyim, the chief representatives of Islamic renewal movement in their time. And then this is where he drops the ball a bit. And the great luminary Al-Imam Muhammad Rashid Ridda, the guiding lighthouse in this modern era. So that statement there, the end part, I think that they clearly have issue because Muhammad Rashid Ridda was not Salafi, did not subscribe to Salafiyya. And again, this is this modernist and Ikhwani and Western academic perspective on him and Muhammad Abdul and Jamaluddin Afghani. But what do you say to those statements there? I think that where he mentions the proponents of Salafiyya and where errors have been made in disputes around theology, law, Sufism, and the opponents saying that Salafiyya is reactionary, against tajdeed, innovation, not innovation in the deen, not innovation in ibadah. We know this is haram. Rational deliberation, ijtihad. These are disagree. Yes, I think these arguments of the opponents are incorrect because Salafiyya is about renewal, in contextualizing the Sunnah within today's societies and wherever we may be living. It's also about ijtihad is applied by our scholars according to the criteria and the principles that are actually there. Salafiyah is actually al-wasat. When you look at what we're facing with violent extremism, the takfiris on one hand, and when we're looking at Sufia and liberalism on the left. So yeah, those arguments of the opponents that he's mentioned there do not stand up in light of the evidence, contemporary and historical, as to where we are as Salafis. What do you make of that statement? Forget the last part about Muhammad Ridda. We cannot accept that whatsoever. Evidence speaks against that. But what do you think of that statement? And I'm going to tell you who that was from, not as an endorsement from him, but the fact that those from outside know Salafiyah, have a perspective of Salafiyah, but for whatever reasons choose to move away in whatever trajectory they've chosen that is in opposition, in part or wholly, against Salafiyah.
So I think, I don't think I have anything else to add to that, but what I would say in some of the language that was used and the language that I see, which is common, a lot of people need to be careful, is with the overgeneralization. So he mentioned, he carved up everything to the critics and their view, and then Salafis, I guess, proponents or adherents and their views. But we have to be careful about overgeneralizing, and that was a big part of my PhD, was really trying to tear those overgeneralizations down and really kind of intricately look at some of these issues, break it down, tear it away from the rhetoric and so forth. Because when you paint the picture too broad, for example, a lot of people who, as the commenter reactionary mentioned about Salafi pubs. So a lot of people in the West, they and the East, in the English speaking world, probably better to say, they associate Salafiyah and anything related to Salafiyah to what they've witnessed with S-pubs. So for them, S-pubs equals Salafiyah. That is the standard. So for them, then they paint the picture of all of those Salafis who differ with them and who are calling to something different in some of the things when it comes to the Hizbiyah, when it comes to these weird, we could subhanAllah, some of the things that, and you see this in the Arab world too. Don't think it's just in the West. I can tell you crazy stories in Yemen, Hizbi list that was handed out. We just laughed. It was the craziest thing I ever heard, especially this brother from down south. He saw it. He said, "Oh no, you better watch out. Your name might be on the Hizbo list." We were crying. We were laughing so hard because literally on the door of a masjid, they put the names, and I won't tell you because I don't want to cause. I know some people, there's the friction in Yemen between different mashayikh and so forth. But the one group who is definitely has those Hizbi principles, which we see from a lot of their students and their mashayikh, were putting this kind of stuff up on the door of a masjid. Can you imagine? And your name is on there. There's a huge list. Someone just did that in the English too, put it on the Facebook, that someone in Philly said, whoever, we can't have a discussion if you mention this person, all because they differ over some issues.
Yes.
It was the issue with Muhammad bin Hadi and this and this and that and that and the other. Subhanallah. So that is Hizbi, Ayn al-Hizbiyah. This is the so the point is not to overgeneralize with what you see. So people love to say Salafis have no manners, Salafis this, Salafis this. So those things I actually went into detail actually in my PhD too, and showing the contradiction, saying, no, this may be the picture that you're getting, but if you're in you're studying, you will see how many of our scholars, not only excellent in manners and adab and teaching us adab and teaching us books in adab. Go to Sheikh Abdul Haqq, go to Sheikh Ibrahim Rahili, go to, we can countless, even those scholars that are shadid in speaking about innovations, and, everyone mistakes and gets things correct, but they do give tarbiyah. They're raising their students. This isn't what we learned in their halaqat, to be extremist and crazy. There are some that are, and especially a lot of times younger mashayikh and stuff like that, who just got their title and just got pumped up and just got pushed to the top, that they make more mistakes. And you will see some Hizbiyah sometimes just being propagated. Like, what are you talking about? It goes against everything we've learned, and it goes against the sheikh that you're making ta'zeem and exalting. It goes against what he's been teaching us for years. And in his books, go to his books. What you're saying is nonsense. It's hizbiyah. So, yeah.
Carry on.
Yeah, so I was just saying just those overgeneralizations. And this comes also, it comes in many forms. This is what, for example, our brother who wrote the cult papers, when this name kind of became really out there, even his title, I like the content was very nice because he mentioned Salafi Mashayikh talking about the ills of Hizbiyah and so forth. But I did not like that title. It was a very blanket title, as if Salafi. So I was wondering, who is this guy? Is this guy? Mm-hmm. This guy must be like some Ikhwani who's just hard in the paint. But actually, he's quoting all from Salafi scholars. And we have to be careful with the language we use, the terminology we use, and just not putting in a plug for our Sheikh Ibrahim Raheli, Hafidhullah Ta'ala, but he was so meticulous about this, in his teaching. He would always remind us and say, hey, that try your best to use Sharia-based terminologies. Don't, try not to go outside that. Use things that you have an imam for, that you have a precedence in the Sharia. And that gives you so much more safety, because when we see all these kids out there who are now on the line, haven't studied, doing this, doing their cut and paste videos, this one's doing this, doing this, they have no restrictions. Their restrictions are social media. Their restrictions are not the Sharia. So they just go with anything their Hawa leads them to the right, it leads them to the left, it goes front, it goes back. They go with it. And this is problematic. It's very problematic. So I could go on and on, and I'm going to cut that.
I think
shift it back to you with it, or take it to the next direction. I know we're getting short on time now. We're getting down. We've been about an hour now. But go ahead.
Yeah. So we're just about to conclude, and I think that it's a very apt area to conclude on, and that's why when referencing, we can't just throw out things. When, for example, when speaking about the cult, I think, I've been very specific in my analysis and where I've been directing that. But as you've rightly said, overgeneralization is problematic. For those who think, but looking at a cult, that it represents the Salafiyah is grossly incorrect. And I think it's very necessary for the other Salafi voices, like yours, like mine, like Sheikh Abu Usama, Sheikh Tahir White, Munir Mufti, many other, I'm talking about in the West in this instance, and I'm a Sheikh. We cannot forget I'm a Sheikh. You've mentioned Sheikh Ibrahim Raheli.
You got a ton in the UK too. You're from the UK. You didn't mention a lot of, it's not a time for shout outs, but there's a lot of brothers, mashallah, and a lot of mashayikh and talabat al-ilm that have been doing fantastic.
Yeah, no, you from a UK perspective, we've got Muawiyah Tucker, we've got Abdul Wahid, who are the younger brothers who've come through. And we've got these brothers there, mashallah, tabarakallah. So Abdul Rahman Hassan, we've got these individuals there. So the younger brothers coming up. Yep, Abu Taymiyyah. So we've got a lot of them there, which jazakallah khair for pointing to them. They know that I know who they are. That's why I'm referring to your neck of the woods, mashallah. But it's very, very important that what we've seen with the term Salafiyah has been misconstrued and misapplied by non-Muslim Western academics within our own framework, can you say, or paradigm, communities. We've seen, I use this term often, a bastardization of the term Salafiyah from within. It's thrown at everything, okay? And it doesn't represent, and those doing that often don't represent what Salafiyah is and should be. And I think this is a good point to conclude on. There's so much more. We could be talking for hours on terminology and everything. And I think that it's been good that we've concluded on this particular point. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion off air around certain things that have been said, mashallah, tabarakallah. If there's anything you want to add, please do, and then we conclude, inshallah.
Yeah. So I guess, it's so important for us to have these discussions, and also to kind of lay down a precedence of what is Salafiyah. What do we get from our scholars? What have we got from our years of being in those communities? And you've had major roles in communities there in Brixton and so forth, and what did we learn? What did we learn from the scholars? Because that's really, when you look at even the groups of innovation in the various sects and so forth, when you look at them, that the best way to know about them is to know their leaders, know those in the forefront. Meaning for us, they're scholars. So we don't look at the common Ashari, who may even have some tashayya, he may even have some Shia tendencies or this and that and the other. No, we look to their scholars to understand what is their ideology, what is their orientation towards Islam. We need to go back to their sources. Likewise, Salafiyya, we say you need to look to the scholars of Ahl Sunnah, those major scholars, and those less than them in knowledge and years of service in teaching the Sunnah, to know and understand what it is, how to practice this methodology, this approach to Islam. And what is this approach to Islam? Because, as laypersons and even ourselves trying to articulate, we're going to be more prone to make mistakes than the mashayikh. And then the mashayikh compared to the alim. Because how many times have ulama, sunnah, major scholars had to reprimand scholars that have knowledge, but they are less than them in knowledge, or they just make a mistake. As Imam Malik said, everyone gets something correct and can be refuted, except the inhabitant of that grave. And that's a very important principle, to know that Salafi is not in accordance with a particular individual. La yantasib ila shakhs, it's not related to an individual. Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, whatever mistakes he may have made, that's Salafiyya is free from that. Right. And what he got correct, Salafiyya that's Salafiyya. And likewise, Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah and Shaykh al-Islam ibn al-Qayyim and Ibn Khuzaymah and all the way, Imam Ahmed, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Abu Hanifa, all these A'imma. So it is not going back to a person or a personality, but it's going back to those source texts and the methodological approach. And that's what I spent a lot of time in my research, really trying to define that in chapter 1. I think it was a long chapter, because I was going into that and going into also dealing with some of the issues that critiques like Dr. Yasser Qadi, I quoted extensively from him, some of it to rebut some of his claims, because I had to. It was very relevant. He was with Brookings Institute. He did a series. They did a series about Salafism as an antidote, which is actually my thesis title, related to that. So I went through their papers to see what was correct and what was incorrect if we look according to Salafi scholarship. And most of them, what was interesting, said that Salafiyya, and this includes Dr. Qadi, even though he doesn't associate with Salafiyya and claims it's a aberration or what have you, that they all agreed that it was in fact one of the most potent ways of combating extremism, these extreme ideologies of ISIS, of Al-Qaeda, of Boko Haram, or of Shabab, and all these other extremists, that it was one of the most potent ways of dealing with it. And we can talk about that in another podcast, of the intricacies of why, because both of our research intersected with those.
Right.
Those,
my research came to those conclusions as well. That the academics that were looking in, it's undeniable about Salafi effectiveness and efficacy in combating extremism. And the one thing I'd finish on with what you said about all of the ulama, the Salaf and everything, they, for the viewer and for us as a reminder, they have something that none of us have. That even in their mistakes, they get one reward in this issue. We are not afforded that. Hence the need for us to know our levels and to stay in our lanes.
Jazakallah khairan. Jiddan muhim. Very important. Yeah, you're right. Jazakallah khairan, Doctor. And it has been a pleasure as usual. And I look forward to the next, our next podcast in bringing the doctor's lab. Yeah.
Yes. And we will come back in a fortnight, inshallah. And we will bring things to the table. And I think there's this, we look at that statement there. The matter should be explained and explained by trusted, correctly knowledge, frank sheikhs like yourselves. I'm not a sheikh, mashallah. I'm just your normal brother, mashallah.
Myself too included.
The ongoing drama from angles is causing confusion. Yes, it is. And inshallah, we hope to bring some clarification. And as I've mentioned in the previous podcast and this one, redressing the balance, inshallah. And with that, I want to say Jazakallah khair to you, Dr. Khalid, again.
Jazakallah khair.
And Jazakallah khair to the audience and for your input. And we look forward to engaging and conversing with you in a fortnight, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hayyakum Allah.